let's talk for a minute about cooking on Shabbat. We need to be very careful not to add to the commandments of God, nor take away from them. I believe the same principle is here as with kindling a fire. Nowhere does God say, literally, don't cook on Shabbat. Although I can understand where the idea comes from, and that the scripture may even in some way imply it, but God does not literally say, don't cook on Shabbat. So if you say that God commanded us not to cook on Shabbat, then I think that you're adding to the commandments of God. I think the emphasis here in this passage of Scripture is on the gathering and not on cooking on Shabbat. Now I can understand how you come to the conclusion of not cooking on Shabbat, and that's fine. But to say that God commanded us not to cook on Shabbat, I think that's adding to the commandments of God. Some people may consider cooking as work and therefore would disqualify cooking on Shabbat because it's work. I can understand this as well. But I still wouldn't go as far as to say that God said, don't cook on Shabbat. I think that preparing your food in advance is a great idea so you don't have anything vigorous to do on Shabbat. I think it's a good habit to get into. We need to make sure that we have a good balance of keeping God's commandments without adding our own interpretation to it when telling others of God's commandments. Now, the passage of Scripture that I'm referring to is Exodus chapter 16, starting in verse 22. It says, "Now it came about on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, then he said to them, this is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." So they put it aside until morning as Moses had ordered, and it did not become foul, nor was there any worm in it. And Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none." And it came about on the 7th day that some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. So, it's in this passage, Exodus chapter 16, in verse 22 through verse 27, that the rabbis like to use to tell people God commanded us not to cook on Shabbat. Unfortunately, it's not just the rabbis, but it's a lot of people in the Hebrew roots Messianic movement. They use verse 23 to say that God commanded us not to cook on Shabbat. Verse 23 says, "Then he said to them, this is what the Lord meant. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning." Now what they like to do is they like to say that you are supposed to bake everything on Friday, and then you put the leftovers, after you cooked everything, you put the leftovers away. That way you have nothing to cook on Shabbat, you just have leftovers to eat. But it doesn't say that. I pose the question, was it the uncooked remainder that they put aside so that they could cook it on Shabbat? Because it does not specify. Did they bake and did they boil on Shabbat? It is very possible that they did. I believe the context here the gathering is the issue. And nowhere here in this verse or any other verse in Scripture that I am aware of does God literally say, do not cook on Shabbat. In fact, if you go to Exodus chapter 12, verse 16, it's talking about unleavened bread. The first day and the 8th day, or I'm sorry, the first day and the 7th day of unleavened bread. Unleavened bread, day 1 and day 7 is a lot like a Sabbath. It's a day that you are supposed to rest and do no work. And yet, here's what the Father says in Exodus chapter 12, verse 16. On the first day, you shall have a holy assembly, talking about unleavened bread. And another holy assembly on the 7th day. No work at all should be done on them, except what must be eaten by every person. That alone may be prepared by you. So here we have an example of day 1 and day 7 of unleavened bread, which is a commanded holy assembly. It is also a day of rest, a day of no work. And here we have explicit instruction that the food that is to be eaten by the people may be prepared on that day. So I conclude that there is no commandment that literally says, do not cook on Shabbat. However, I can understand how people come up with that idea, and I have no problem with people not cooking on Shabbat. I myself try not to cook on Shabbat or do anything that's rigorous and work, so you just have to be careful not to tell people that God commanded us not to cook on Shabbat, because there's nowhere in the Bible where it says that, and if you do that, I think you're adding to the commandments of God.